Stay with the one and only Schilling Show. There has been grave injustice in this country since January 6th of 2021. Grave injustice. And we try the best we can on this program to keep you posted on the sorts of things that are going on behind the scenes that the mainstream media refuses to cover, the political persecution that's been going on, and all of the problems. I'm very pleased to have with us today Tim Hale, a J6 defendant, and there's a Supreme Court case which is significant coming towards us that we're going to talk about today, as well as the general plight of the J6 political prisoners. Tim Hale, welcome to the Schilling Show.
Hey, thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
All right. I want to start because we haven't talked before, and I want people to know a little bit about you, and I want them to understand, what brought you there in the first place and kind of what you experienced, and then I want to get into what's going on with the court. So could you tell us how you came to be there and what you were expecting on January 6th?
Yeah, sure. Honestly, I just thought there was going to be a speech that day. I didn't even know there was going to be I didn't know there was going to be a march to the Capitol, and I certainly didn't know there was going to be a riot that day. So, I mean, I actually, it's funny, like, they tried to smear us all as, like violent right-wing extremists or whatever. I actually went there in a suit and a tie. I actually went to Men's Warehouse the night before to get brand new dress shoes. So, in my eyes, I was either going to hear President Trump's last public speech for his only term, or theoretically, if we pulled a rabbit out of the hat, then it might be the start of his second presidency. I mean, that's the only reason I went there was to support the president, because I thought it was going to be a historical day.
So tell us how you kind of got caught up in all of this. Like, what happened after the speech or in the midst of the speech that got you entangled?
Well, sure. So, actually, about a half hour before people like me showed up to the Capitol, there was a breach of the perimeter that was set up using like bike racks and some like chicken wire like fencing. And so this group included federal informants. They cut down the fencing. They tore down the barriers. And
I got to stop you for just a second to clarify, because this is very, very important. So when you say the group included federal informants, you mean these were plants who were in there participating in the breaching?
That's correct.
Okay. Yes, go ahead. I just wanted to highlight that because many people refuse to acknowledge that.
No problem. Yeah, no, that's very important because it never gets covered, really.
Right.
So, and not everybody there was, but it's important to understand that there were elements there that basically infiltrated the crowd and influenced their behavior.
Right.
So this happens before people, like a half hour before someone like me even shows up. This happens before Trump's speech is finished. So when these barriers are removed and this perimeter is basically deleted, and there's only like 5 Capitol Police guarding this perimeter, what ends up happening is that thousands of people unknowingly pour into this area, not knowing it's a restricted area. And so this actually, and again, it's important to understand like the mindset. It took me 3 years before I got out of prison so I could do this, but I released video from my phone showing there was nothing happening.
Right.
By the time I showed up, it was just an ocean of peaceful people singing God Bless America, chanting USA and all that. What happened was, like I said, there were people inside the crowd, infiltrators, who were acting as agitators on the front lines that you couldn't see if you were in the back. These agitators incited the police. The police were also, I'm just going to be clear here, fairly incompetent, and they were outnumbered, frankly. They had no idea what they were doing. And so you had this snowball effect where the cops were actually randomly attacking the crowd instead of the agitators. Was that by intention or was that incompetence? It's kind of irrelevant. What ends up happening, though, is that they throw flashbang grenades into the middle of the crowd instead of dealing with all the agitators on the front lines. This incites the crowd, yada, yada, yada. And so what ends up happening is people end up breaching through perimeters even more because they've been agitated.
Right.
Now, this isn't a justification of anything, but long story short, I end up walking through open doors that were already opened up by people that came in before me.
Right.
So people like me actually ended up going inside the Capitol building. We wander around. The Capitol Police tell us to leave, and then we end up leaving. But it's really not what they made it out to be on CNN for like the last 3 years. It's like, yeah, a couple windows were broken. Some people did attack the cops, but there's a lot of context that's missing. And so this would be an instance of entrapment.
We did see videos, and I would like to get your take on this, of Capitol Police or other uniformed people actually opening the doors and welcoming people into the building. Did you witness that, or have you talked to anybody who witnessed that?
Yeah, and that's true. And again, like it's not a universal experience for everyone.
Yes.
But this was true on the east side. There were doors where Capitol Police just stood by, open doors. And even if they might have been like, like sometimes they just shrug their shoulders like, what am I going to do? And to be fair, what can you expect when there's so many people there? But there's a lot of, I post a lot about this on Twitter. There are a lot of interesting coincidences with the timing. You see different breaches happening simultaneously. You see groups that seem to be coordinating on the inside and outside. And so it's definitely worth considering how this was done so well by people who'd never been there in the first place. How would they know how to do all this?
So tell us what charges were levied against you, and were they done on the spot, or did they track you down later, or how did that work?
So this is an interesting thing. I was arrested about a week after January 6th.
Mm-hmm.
I was a union representative for naval contractors, and my management team actually turned me in to NCIS. NCIS then had my roommate wear a wire on me to try to get me to say something incendiary or incriminating. So I actually initially only got like a couple misdemeanors. But what happened was after the administration changed, after the inauguration, suddenly I got indicted with this 18 U.S.C. 1512 charge that's pending in front of the Supreme Court right now. So that's when I got hit with this so-called obstruction of an official proceeding charge. That's my only felony. If it gets tossed out by the court, I'm no longer a felon.
I want to get to that after the break because we do have a half an hour together with Tim Hale, a J6 defendant, and we're talking about the Supreme Court case, which we will get to momentarily. But I just think it's so important for your story and the way you were treated to be broadcast and told far and wide. So let's talk about what happened after you had these charges against you. I'm assuming that you were imprisoned, and if you could tell us about that experience because we've heard some horrible things.
Absolutely. So some context here is that I was an amateur comedian, and so what they did was they destroyed all my social media. They basically eliminated 14 years of my life's work so that they could frame me as being this degenerate, extremist bigot and stuff like that. Because
how did they tell us, please, if you would? How did they destroy your social media? Did they actually go in and manipulate it, or did they put bots on it? What did they do to you?
They actually seized my Facebook accounts and all my other accounts, and they straight up deleted them. So all my social media got just nuked off of the internet. And so, like, when I'm trying to defend my character during a bond hearing, when they're trying to argue that we're all dangerous to society, even though I'm not even being charged with violent crimes, there's no way to defend myself. So that would be exculpatory evidence that was withheld. I'm still trying to get that back. But yeah, I mean that's essentially what happened to me. My case is a little different than others. They really tried to use like thought crimes, like memes from my phone, like offensive jokes and stuff like that, to show that basically I was your typical racist Trump supporter. The whole that whole narrative that they've been pushing. So I got denied bonds, and they actually held us in solitary confinement for over a year in the D.C. gulag, as it's called. I spent 3 years incarcerated. It took 16 months for me to even get a trial, despite the fact that the Speedy Trial Act says you're supposed to have a trial within 70 days if you invoke that right. It took me 16 months, a year and a half, to get a trial. And there were a lot of other civil rights violations in that time. We weren't allowed to groom. I couldn't even get a haircut for 16 months. You were denied religious services. I could barely even see my lawyer. It was actually during the week of my trial they wouldn't even let me see my lawyer. We couldn't get access to evidence. We couldn't even get family visitations. And so, I mean, in every way, just again, from the solitary confinement to just the isolation from the world, lack of sunlight, lack of nutrition, and then eventually, of course, once I was finally convicted by a biased jury, all of which worked for the United States government. That's something to consider for Trump's case in D.C., how biased these jurors are going to be. I finally got sentenced. I got over twice my sentencing guidelines. I should have gotten time served at 21 months, but because the feds had a narrative they wanted to paint about me, I ended up getting 4 years.
My goodness.
So I actually had to go to a federal prison here in New Jersey, FCI Fort Dix, where I spent another year in prison. But because President Trump signed the First Step Act, I only had to do 3 years of that 4-year sentence.
I want to ask you before we go to the break here, and just in a minute or so, did you have your own legal counselor, or was someone appointed for you?
Initially, I had an appointed legal counsel. I did have a public defender. I had to switch to a private counsel because that was just completely untenable. Even if you're being as charitable as possible, and you said that these public defenders were nice people, but they just weren't up for the task. The truth is that they were sabotaging our cases absolutely sabotaging our cases. They were personal friends with all the prosecutors, and they didn't lift a finger to help us, the truth is.
This is what I suspected, and I'm so glad that you're speaking freely. We're talking with Tim Hale, a J6 defendant. When we come up on the other side of this break here in our final segment together with Tim, we'll talk about a SCOTUS case that's coming up that could be monumental in bringing at least some modicum of justice to these people who've been treated like trash political prisoners. Stay with the Schilling Show. We return in just a moment. All right, the Schilling Show continues. Another segment with J6 defendant Tim Hale telling us this harrowing story. And boy, I have so much more to ask, but I do want to get to the Supreme Court case that's coming up on Section 1512. Maybe you could provide us with a little bit of background on what that is, and then let's talk about the case.
Sure thing. Yes, sir. So, for those that don't know, federal laws are similar to state laws or any other. They come in the form of statutes. And so there's a statute at the federal level called 18 U.S.C. 1512. 18, it signifies it's from the Title 18 of the Federal Code. So 18 U.S.C. 1512 originally goes back to the 1980s. The true title for it is tampering with a witness. What ended up happening is that after the Enron scandal, a substatute was added in 2003, and they call this obstruction of an official proceeding. Now, what it actually entails is the destruction of documents. And so this, of course, it's not a huge leap to go from, say, tampering with a witness so they can't testify and tampering with documents so they can't be reviewed. Congress has a quasi-judicial, a quasi-judicial authority despite being the legislative branch. So they have the power of inquiry. And so that's really what this statute is about. Now, after January 6th, many years since 2003, for the first time, the federal government started charging people with this substatute for riotous behavior or for protesting. The legal theory, which is insane, is that by interrupting Congress and the certification vote on January 6th, that this was somehow obstructing Congress's power of inquiry over documents. This makes absolutely no sense.
No.
And so, essentially, here's what people ought to really know as well. The first judge to uphold this statute for January 6th was a district judge named Dabney Friedrich. And her husband, funny enough, her husband was actually on the Enron task force. So that's a little suspicious. And frankly, it seems like even if it's not suspicious, she should have recused herself for that personal connection to the very event and investigation that would lead to said statute that she herself upheld. The second thing to consider is frankly who she upheld it for. She first upheld 18 U.S.C. 1512 for three federal informants, three co-defendants named Nathan DeGrave, Ronald Sandlin, and Josiah Colt. It's funny enough, Ronald Sandlin actually told me inside the D.C. jail, he actually bragged about the fact his co-defendant, Nathan DeGrave, was caught in a drug conspiracy in 2020, which is why they were really at the Capitol in 2021. So they were turned out by the feds as assets. So the third thing to consider is that this charge isn't just being used against J6 defendants, it's now being used against President Trump. So one really has to take a step back and think, how far back did they actually start planning to weaponize this statute? I had mentioned that I didn't get the 1512 charge until after the inauguration. That's when I was indicted, when the administration changed.
Interesting.
If people had just had, typical, if people didn't get the obstruction charges, there's a very high likelihood, I would say, that people would have had much fairer chances in the court of law. But what ended up happening is that this administration wanted to weaponize 1512. Some would say they used it as leverage to get plea deals, to get convictions, and that's certainly possible. But what I also think it is that I think it was also really a manhunt. We know that Graves and all those in the DOJ were doing what they called the shock and awe. So I would say that this was certainly planned. I think this was planned to get President Trump using us. I would say it was also just a way to silence and probably scare the hell out of regular Americans, thinking that they could end up getting a 20-year sentence for walking into a government building in protest. And we've actually seen them, if you look at some of the Proud Boy and Oath Keeper cases, they did get 20 years. Granted, they slapped on seditious conspiracy and a bunch of other nonsense, but this is the country we're living in. So this was planned ahead of time.
It strikes me, and we're talking with Tim Hale, J6 defendant, that this was a shot across the bow to anybody who wants to have a peaceful protest or gathering in opposition to the government, the leftists in the government, that you don't ever dare do this again. Don't ever have a rally in D.C. that has anything to do with the conservative cause, support of President Trump, or anything else, because we will get you. Do you think that's the signal?
I absolutely think that's what it is. And again, the time frame is really relevant here. Since 2003, it never occurred to the government to use this statute against rioters and protesters, even though, let's keep it real, they happen all the time, always in this country. Even if you want to isolate it to federal cases. Look at the rioting in Portland. Look at the attacks on the federal courthouse. You look in D.C., even when we were in the gulag. I can't drive this home enough. When we were in the D.C. jail, there was rioting in D.C. by environmental radicals ramming bike racks into police. And I never saw one of them in that jail with us.
There is also a concern, and I've just got about a minute or two to address this, if you would, please, Tim, about redress for the horrible mistreatment, unconstitutional mistreatment and suffering that you've done. Aside from getting cleared, if that happens with this court case, is there a way or a class action suit that you and your fellow J6 political prisoners could go after the government for their various abuses?
It would really depend. Well, first, I think probably, but I think that it's going to depend really on how this court addresses the statute in the first place, whether it was overly broad or what have you. I think that people need to remember, and this is something I had a lot of time to think about while researching case law, is that it's really hard to sue the government. Prosecutors and executive officials, they usually have qualified immunity. Judges have absolute immunity. It's really hard to hold the government accountable unless really sometimes the government actually has to consent to being sued in many cases. So I think, honestly, the easiest path is, it's not quite easy, but the easiest path is for President Trump to just get back into office and then direct the DOJ to just do the right thing. Unfortunately, that might have to be the best-case scenario here.
If people want to get more information on what's going on here with the J6 political prisoners, your specific case, or any other information, is there a clearinghouse or a website where they could go to get more?
Sure. If you want to find out about some of the federal informants, I've outed quite a few of them. If you want to find out about the infiltration or just about the mistreatment inside the jail, I've posted a lot since I've gotten out, so you can find me on Twitter at Tim Hale, criminally funny J6er. And if you want to actually help, contribute something to support the families, because a lot of these guys were the breadwinners. Yeah. And so they can't. So if you want to, you can go to patriotfreedomproject.com. Anything you can give to help support them would be appreciated. There's 1,400 plus people who've been charged so far, and they're bragging they're going to get another 1,000 before the election coming up, and I don't doubt they're going to try. So anything that people can contribute, either in terms of financial support or even just in terms of spreading the word and bringing awareness, we all in the January 6th community would appreciate it. And I thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate you having me on, sir. Well,
I appreciate you joining us and telling the truth about what happened, and I know many in my audience join me in praying for justice to be done. Tim Hale, thank you for being with us today on The Schilling Show.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless. Okay. We have to do those shows every once in a while because people forget, or there's a lot of people you hear talking who just dismiss all these people like we should just forget about them, or they deserve everything they're getting. They're just vicious and vile without realizing the principles that have been broken to attack this group as political prisoners could someday be turned against them as well. So we ought to be looking out for everybody who's treated unjustly by the government. But this is the most egregious and atrocious thing I could possibly imagine. I'm sure there could be worse things, and maybe there are worse things coming. But we will continue to keep you posted on these various cases, and particularly this Supreme Court case, which